Hey, welcome back, A-Push Kids. We're here for our next lecture on the British colonial regions. Last time we were here, we were comparing and contrasting the Chesapeake colonies with that of the New England colonies. And today we're going to kind of continue that. We're going to be looking at some new regions. So we're going to be looking at the Middle colonies, the Deep South, and then we're going to be looking at the early institutions of government across all of the colonies. Now that brings us to back to our essential question, same one from last time. Explain how and why environmental and other factors shape the development and expansion of various British colonies that developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754. So our third key idea is the middle colonies are going to support a flourishing export economy based on cereal crops and attracted a broad range of European immigrants, leading to societies with greater cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity as well as tolerance. Now, the first middle colony is going to be the New Netherlands. So it's created by the Dutch West India Company. We talked about that two different videos ago when we talked about how it attracted settlers. They had a lot of different people there, including Swedes, Germans, Africans, very, very diverse. It was founded by a joint stock company, the Dutch West India Company. Now, Britain, though, doesn't like the Dutch, really kind of in between their Chesapeake and New England colonies. If we look at the map on the left-hand side, you can see the blue British colonies up north, and then like Salem, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then down in Virginia, you can see Dutch settlements just north of Maryland, up along what is today New Jersey, up through New York, up the Hudson River. And the British don't like that. They're worried that this is going to lead not only to conflict, but it could also interfere with the British ability to earn money and profits in these particular regions. So in 1664, the British are going to seize control of the Dutch colony from them, and they're going to rename it New York after the Duke of York, who's the person that takes over the Dutch colony. Now, geographically speaking, we do need to make sure that we note the geography of the region. It's mostly dominated by deep harbors and good river systems, and because because of this, it's going to really kind of develop into a breadbasket economy. So they're going to produce these cereal crops such as wheat, corn, things like that. And we see a very large commercial centers develop here as well. New York, Philadelphia become these really, really large commercial centers. And because of their focus on commerce, the middle colonies are going to be known for their diversity and their tolerance in this particular region. Both New York and Pennsylvania, which are the two really big colonies, as well as New Jersey, are going to really be known for this tolerance that they have. Now, of all these colonies, probably one of the most important is going to be Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania is founded in 1681 by a guy named William Penn. Now, if you're like, I think I've seen a picture like that before, that's because William Penn was part of a group known as the Quakers. And you may have seen his likeness on a Quaker oatmeal box at some point in your life. Now, the Quakers, they're a religious sect. And so they believe in this thing called an inner light, and everybody's equal, and everybody can directly communicate with God. Now, today, many people would seem to think that, oh, that seems kind of normal in terms of what's being taught in Christian churches. However, back then, this was a little out there, and so like other religious groups, like the Puritans and Pilgrims, the Quakers were being persecuted in England. And so what Penn wanted to do is he wanted to provide a haven for his people. And so he was a wealthy landowner. He was a personal friend to the King of England. And he wanted to create this holy experiment in the New World to promote religious tolerance. And so what he's going to do is he's going to buy land from Native Americans. He's going to ban slavery. He's going to allow a diverse population to move there. And so we're going to see that Pennsylvania is going to be much, much different from all of the other colonies that are around it in those traits. Huge ports, Philadelphia and New York are going to develop there. And so soon we see that they're going to have a much bigger population than really anybody else that's there. So let's move on to our next key idea. So we want to look at the colonies of the South Atlantic coast and the British West Indies next. Now, we're going to see a long growing season. We're going to see the development of plantation-based economies based on staple crops. They're going to depend on the labor of enslaved Africans, who will oftentimes be the majority of the population. And they're going to develop, these African populations are going to develop their own cultural and religious autonomy, or at least attempt to. So if we're going to look at the lower southern colonies, those are the ones in blue on the map on the right hand side. So that's parts of North Carolina, which is very sparsely settled this time, but especially South Carolina and a little bit of Georgia. Now, they're the last colonies to be formed. In fact, Georgia isn't founded until 1732, significantly later than anybody else. Now, for the most part, Carolinas and Georgia, like Virginia, they're going to develop a cash crop economy. We're going to see slavery develop, big gaps between the rich and the poor, but what they're growing is going to be a little bit different. What you see on the right-hand side, we see the pictures, they're growing rice. Rice becomes one of the big export crops from places like South Carolina. So unlike in the Chesapeake region, places like Maryland and Virginia, where they're going to be growing a lot of tobacco, in the Carolinas, it's a slightly different crop that they're growing, but the social structure is going to be very similar. Now, Georgia is a little bit different, and you guys learned a lot about the settlement of Georgia in 8th grade Georgia studies. We hopefully know that James Oglethorpe is going to be the founder of the colony, but mainly this is a buffer colony. We're still very worried about the Spanish in Florida and places like St. Augustine. We're worried that they may attack. And South Carolina and places like Charleston were very profitable. And so we wanted to make sure that there was some sort of buffer in between them, some people that could absorb or slow down a Spanish attack that may come. And so when Georgia was created, it was this buffer colony. They bring in lots of debtors, prisoners to come to Georgia. It also helps by kind of alleviating some of the population pressures in English jails. Now, finally, in terms of colonies, we have the British Indies, the British West Indies. So the British also had colonies in the Caribbean. Now, what's kind of interesting about these colonies in the Caribbean is they were by far the most profitable of all of the British colonies. If you added up the profits of all 13 major colonies from Georgia all the way up to Massachusetts and New Hampshire, they were not as profitable as the single speck of island that was Barbados. Barbados made the British Empire more money than the other 13 colonies combined. It was incredibly profitable. That, Jamaica, and a few other ones produced sugar, and sugar was very, very profitable for the British. This will play a role in what happens later on during the American Revolution. So we'll kind of get to that a little bit later on, but they're going to literally eat up a huge slave population. A lot of slaves will go to these sugar plantations, and many of them will die in the atrocious conditions that are there. Our last key idea is we do want to talk about the colonial governments and how colonial governments are going to develop and what that relationship is going to be like with England. Now, the biggest thing to remember here is that distance is very, very important. And so distance and Britain's initially lack of attention led to the colonies creating self-governing institutions that were unusually democratic for the era. New England colonies based their power on participatory town meetings, which in turn elected members to their colonial legislatures. In the southern colonies, elite planters exercised local authority and also dominated the elected assemblies. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to compare and contrast these two regions and how they developed early governmental institutions. Now, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, British colonies were governed by a policy that was called salutary neglect. This is basically kind of this idea of a beneficial neglect. British Parliament and the King controlled the colonies, but they didn't enforce any of their policies. They neglected the colonies as long as they were profitable and as long as they were loyal. Now, most of the colonies had a royal governor. Salaries paid by the colonists, so governors really didn't overturn local laws and typically listened to the local colonial assemblies that paid their salaries rather than the British Crown. Now, this loose control really allowed the colonists to create their own assemblies and have a lot of power of themselves. They were usually very democratic self-governments, and they were made up of colonists who passed their own laws and taxed themselves. Now, typically, no matter where you were, colonial assemblies were controlled by the wealthy landowners, people that had land, had power, were the ones that were there. Now, the two biggest examples of colonial government were the Virginia House of Burgesses and Massachusetts town meetings. So let's take a look at Massachusetts town meetings first. Now, most of these are centered on the church and town meetings. Now, New England towns, each of them was independently governed by local church members. And if you were a male church member, you were allowed to vote for local laws and local taxes. Now, eventually the Massachusetts colony would grow, and it's going to spawn a few new colonies: New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New Haven, and Connecticut. Now, Connecticut will eventually form and create the first written constitution in the New World. The name of the first written constitution is the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. But the people of Massachusetts were very used to governing themselves in these very small units. Now, this is in a way similar to what we see happening down in Virginia. Now, 1619, a huge year in American history. One of the reasons why is that we have the first slave ship that comes to Jamestown, but it's also the year that the House of Burgesses is established. It's the first legislative assembly in America. Now, Virginia was a royal colony, so the governor was chosen by the king, but the House of Burgesses made the important decisions regarding laws, taxes, and other things. Now, a burgess was a landowner. So the House of Burgesses was made up of the wealthy landowners of the colony of Virginia. But this oftentimes led to conflict. So even though they're elected and they're rich planters, they don't always represent the poor farmers of the colonies. Now, we should remember that indentured servants make up a very large portion of the population still, even by the mid to late 1600s. African slaves are growing in numbers, but it's still indentured servants, and there's a lot of poor farmers that are there. Now, Western Virginia is going to be suffering. Low tobacco prices in the 1670s and frequent Native American attacks are going to lead poor farmers and indentured servants to lead a rebellion against the Burgesses. They're led by a guy named Nathaniel Bacon, and he's going to blame Virginia's governor for not protecting them and start this rebellion. It's named after their leader, and becomes known as Bacon's Rebellion. And although Nathaniel Bacon will die very early on in the conflict, what it does is it is kind of a turning point in early colonial history. Because what it does is it proves to Virginians, especially to the Burgesses, these rich planters, that slaves are going to be better than indentured servants. Slaves aren't going to ask for land. They're easier for the plantation owners to control because they can sell them and move them if they need to, whereas you can't do that with the indentured servants. And so what we're going to see with Bacon's Rebellion is this switch from indentured servitude to slavery as the preferred means for the workforce in Virginia. Well, that brings us to the end of our lecture for today. A few key points to remember is we looked at the middle colonies and how they're very diverse and very tolerant. We looked at the southern colonies and how they produce cash crops, though different from those of the Chesapeake. And then we compared and contrast the governmental systems of both the Chesapeake colonies with the House of Burgesses to that of the New England town meetings, and how they were similar in both that they were representative, but that they were different in that in the South it was only wealthy landowners that were able to have political control. Well, that's all for this time. Until next time, go Pack.